So I'm going to talk about soil and planting. And I know that sounds like a really basic topic. Who does not know how to put a plant in the ground? After all, we are gardeners, and we probably putting dozens of plants into the ground every year and have been doing this for decades. However, I hope to provide you with some information that's based on horticultural research, and perhaps after this class is going to give you some new ideas in terms of what to do in the garden. So my goal, and obviously the coloring didn't work because it looked really great on the PC, but you can't see what my goals are. So let me tell you, my hope is after this presentation, you will be able to gain knowledge in 3 areas. The first one is some basic characteristics of healthy soil and how to build healthy soil in your garden. And the second and third go hand in hand. How to prepare the ground, soil, and how to prepare plants for planting. So after the talk, we're going to do a little check in to see how we accomplish each one of them. All right. So the new research that informs gardening practices, I'm going to highlight 3 things. This doesn't mean that the research just completed yesterday and it's flash news, but the gardening practices based on these research just are not widespread enough. So I selected them for that particular reason. So the first one is pretty straightforward. Planting in fall minimizes the stress on plants compared to planting any other time of the year. So that's an easy one. The second one may be a little shocking and new. Removing the planting medium in a container that you buy from the nursery, or a B&B, burlap plant, removing the soil or other things packed around it, and looking at the bare roots and making corrections by pruning, by straightening, if it's possible, before putting the plant in the ground, enhances the plant's survival. I know that's a little new. And then the third thing is a little complicated, and it has to do with something called interphase. And what we want to do is remove all of our past gardening practices that create interphase in the soil in which the roots of our plants will be growing through. So let me give you some, let me first explain what is interphase. The interphase is where different soil types meet each other underground. So what would be a soil texture class or type? Simplest examples would be clay or sand. We are familiar with these terms. But making them a little more complex, master gardeners have to learn this thing called the soil triangle. And it gives many more finer types or classes of soil based on the percentage of clay, sand, and silt. If you pay for a soil test, that's one of the things you're done. Setting aside this complex triangle, let me talk about a couple of things in our gardening practices that create interphase, and I think that will make things easier and clearer. So first of all, when we put a plant in the ground directly, so the roots are in the potting media, and I remove the medium of this plant, and you can see the perlite or vermiculite floating to the surface, And the stuff underneath may have peat moss and composted wood chips. That's usually the components of a bagged potting mix that you would find. So think about it just intuitively. How does this mixture, as is shown here in this container, compare with our garden soil? My guess is it's pretty different, right? So that two different types come together will form an interface. And I just said interface is between the different soil classes impedes movement of three very important things: water, roots, and nutrient. So by planting a container plant directly into the ground, into native garden soil, we're creating an interface around what we put into the hole, okay? And the second thing is, I suppose nearly everyone in this room, including me, when we plant, we want to create a nice environment for the plant roots. So we would amend the soil that goes back into the hole we dig by adding some compost, adding some other nice things to make the soil very fluffy, because we are doing our plants a big favor so the roots can grow easier. Is that, who doesn't do that? Well, just the really cruel people. There's one in the back who does not do that and has the nerve to raise her hand. Okay, so in fact, that's not a good thing, because amending soil into the planting hole, we're creating an interface between this nice amended fluffy soil and the garden soil next to it. So the roots may grow very happily in the short term, but when it hits the interface, it doesn't work. So it's a short-term gain as opposed to a long-term success. And that's the difference. So you say, why didn't you tell me this sooner? Einstein said it pretty well. If we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, right? So let's look at each of these topics in greater detail. Okay, I talked about preparing the roots before we put them in the ground. And the best way to prepare the roots and make corrections is by looking at it closely and carefully. And we can only do that if we remove medium, soil, everything that came with the roots, so we can look at the bare root system. And you can do that by soaking it in water, bucket of water, that help wash off most of the soil, and then shaking it off. I like to use a hose to speed it up. One thing I want to say is this material here, this liquid material, don't just dump it anywhere. You want to save it and use it eventually to water the plant that you're putting into the ground, because there are probably soil microbes and nutrients already in that, so we don't want to waste them. So what are we looking at? This is the bare root of that tree. Okay, we're looking for a few things. We're looking at the roots carefully and see which way these roots are growing. And anything that is not, and the ideal root system should be spread out like arms of or rays of a sea star. Okay, so think of the starfish in your mind as the ideal model. And then compare it against the roots you have and see what's wrong. Who's going the wrong way? So we have something going upward toward the air. We have a number of them that are circling. Can you see the ones that are growing in an arc? Okay, so if you're looking at the roots closely, you should be able to see that better. This is just a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional object. But as you have a washed out roots in front of you, you will be able to identify everything that was wrong with it. And everything that's wrong, meaning roots going the wrong way in circles, or going up instead of down, or sideways should be removed. In addition, anything that is damaged, ripped, broken should be removed before we plant it into the ground. So let me show you what this is the before, what the after looks like. I know you say, wow. And these are pruning marks. Make sure you make the cut clean and neat and minimize any ripping because that will damage the roots. And remember the roots, the problem roots, we saw one that was pointed up, a number of them that were circling. They're all gone. What's the problem with leaving these roots and just put the plant in the ground? There have been many trees, this is a tree, that have been planted, not doing well, and then die eventually after 5 years or longer. As the plant gets bigger, the roots continue to grow in a circle. There have been, through research, trees excavated from the ground and that they're girdled to death by the circling roots. And that is the reason for correcting the roots before planting. So let me show you some smaller plants. This is a medium-sized shrub. Same thing. You will see container forcing a web, a very tightly wound web of roots at the bottom. And when it's washed and straightened out, it's free to go into the soil. Look at a smaller plant, same thing. And the reason why roots from a container do that is because the plant had been growing in the container for too long. We all like a good sale at the end of the season, right? And end of the season, the plant has been in the container for too long, so it's likely to look like that. And in this root, you can see a lot of dead ones that grew through the holes in the bottom, so they were exposed to air, other things, and they're dead already. And the healthy roots that are white have been growing against the edge of the pot. And when this plant, if you can look at the bottom, you'll see a very thick mat, which basically make trying to straighten that out, or even getting to the medium in the center, almost impossible. So sometimes we just have to do major surgery and cut off the bottom in order to get to the medium and the roots. And this picture shows washing out the medium. So, all right. So now that you know the brutal steps involved in getting your roots ready to go into the ground, now let's talk about soil preparation. And the important thing is don't dig the hole until you can see the root system and how big it is. Because we want the hole to have the same depth of the root system and at least twice the width of its diameter. Because most plant roots grow more shallow on the surface. And dig the hole, remove anything, debris, rocks, other roots, etc., from that hole. And then the native soil you dig out of the hole, break it up some because you're going to put it back in that hole. So that makes it easier to work with. And then in the hole, in the center of it, or roughly the center, we're going to make a mound. And that mound is going to be made with the soil you dug out and broke up into smaller bits. And that mound is where we put our washed root system. So it supports the roots. And remember the image of the starfish, the rays of the arms spreading over the mound? That's how we want to arrange it, ideally. Once the roots are spread out, we want to check the crown. So the crown is where the top meets the roots. That point should always be at or just above soil level. We don't want it to be sinking into the ground. And remember, when you are checking the level of the crown, as we water in this hole here, the soil will settle because we're adding soil that's been chopped up, so it has a lot of space for air, right? So you want to, when you do the initial check for the crown, you want to make sure that it's a little higher rather than a little too low. Because as we water, soil will settle and the plant root system will settle down as well. So then we'll begin to fill the hole in several steps. Put some soil into it. So we're adding soil. Here we have a mound, and we'll make the mound a little bigger and wider by adding some soil, spreading the roots. And if you have a root that is massive like this, with lots of parts, take a close look at it. There will be some roots that are coming from higher up and some roots that are coming out from below. So the way to finesse the root system ideally is you put the plant down on that mound, add the soil, and then look at the roots that are coming from higher up and pull them out. So you're filling the hole slowly, gradually, and you're burying parts of the root system in a few steps. Is that making sense? Okay, so each step we add soil and we water. We water it well and let it drain. And then we continue to put in more soil, bury more roots, and water it in. And in the end, when we're done with the soil and water, we want to, so when you look at a root system like this, these ones on the surface may be highest, the final ones to be buried under soil. And the ones that are pointed down below in the inside of the image we see will be the first to be buried under soil. Okay, and we want to always firm the soil with the watering and the burying each layer with our hands, not stepping on them, because the feet will be too heavy. But the hand firming will make sure there is good, solid contact between the root system and the soil. Now, let's talk about healthy soil. Healthy soil by volume should be half water and air. If you have walked in the forest or other areas where the soil had not been disturbed with minimum foot traffic, you know the feeling of stepping on that soil. It's light, it kind of bounces. It's as if we're sinking a little and bouncing up. And that's an indication of healthy soil with lots of volume, dedicated or occupied by air and water. And why is that important? Because we know air and water in the soil allows the roots to spread, to breathe, and to get nutrients. So, the important thing in keeping our soil healthy is to avoid compaction. And the most common sources of compaction are people walking on soil, foot traffic, or running equipment over it. And because we know compaction will remove the space that is so essential to healthy soil and allow the free movement of root system and allow air and water to be in it to support healthy plant growth. Something that is a long-term fix for soil that may not be ideal gardening soil, and that is organic mulch. In the old days, we would say, and there's more detail in your handout, in the old days we would say, add organic materials, add compost, add whatever other kind of organic materials to your soil, work it in, and that's great. But if you read the handout, you will see the philosophy now, based on research, is either you add organic material, work it in to the entire root zone of the plant, or don't do it. Because if you're not taking care of the entire root zone of the plant, you're creating interphase, right? And we want to avoid interphase. So when we talk about vegetable garden annuals, stuff that come and go short-term residency in our garden, amend the whole thing, because we know their roots don't get usually that big or that deep. But if we're talking about trees and shrubs, long-term residents that will be staying in our garden for 10 years, decades, there is no practical way to amend the soil of the entire root zone of those large plants. So the solution is do not amend, but use organic mulch. And the recommendation for use of organic mulch, so this picture shows wood chips that you can get for free from arborists that go around and prune, and they have all these things chipped up and trying to find places to leave them. And these three things are important. The first one is 4 inches, so not an inch, half an inch, or thin layer doesn't do much good. Gotta be thick enough. Second, it's a mulch, which means it stays on top of the soil. It does not get mixed into the soil, so it just stays on top. Okay? And then the third thing, with the plant's trunk, trees, shrubs, etc., do not bury them, because when they're buried, they stay moist, potential problem for pathogens to grow. Also in the winter, the buried areas of a tree trunk is likely to be the warmest, coziest places for vermin to be, and they will be eating your tree trunk during the winter when they're hungry. So you always have your thick layer and then feather to the trunk, meaning taper it down and don't let it touch the trunk. Okay? So let me just say a few quick things about what to do after you plant. I've mentioned the mulching, up to 4 inches of wood chips, and or other organic materials. Now wood chips are lighter, so there is more air space in between, and they also decompose slower. So it's a more economical way to mulch than with something like compost, which is heavier, less air in between, and you have to pay for it, and it's more backbreaking work as you move compost around. A few other things, if you have a large tree, especially evergreen with a heavy top, probably need to stake it the first season. And the best practices for staking, 2 or 3 point to support. Secondly, only use materials that will not damage, rub against the trunk, not too tight, so that the plant can still move a little bit, and that encourages stronger root growth. And the connection where you tie to the trunk should be low rather than high. Low, bottom 1/3, as opposed to near the top. Okay? Watering is extremely important in the first season because the plant we put in the ground has a severely damaged root system. So the first year, be vigilant with watering. Fertilizing, research shows the materials that are called transplant, especially helpful chemicals, is a waste of money. And if you fertilize in the first year, use something that is nitrogen focused because it'll help with the green growth. But our soil are not deficient in phosphorus and potassium, so don't use it unless if it's really needed with the soil test result. And finally, pruning. There are lots of misconceptions about when you plant something new, you're supposed to prune the top to match a truncated root system. Wrong. Do not prune unless if you see something that's dead, damaged, broken, disease, take those out. But otherwise, leave it alone.